Good. So happy New Year to all of you and welcome to this first meeting of the Cañada-Blanch Centre at the LSE in this Lent term 2023. I got the pleasure to have with me Professors Riccardo Crescenzi and Carlo Petrovelli. Dalia Taglioni, unfortunately, is ill, so she's not going to be able to make it. It was expected. And we're going to be dealing with a topic that is of maximum interest these days, which is the whole idea of global value chains and how do they impact on regional development in the case of Latin America. And if you allow me, I'm going to just give a few words and make a few words about the situation in Latin America in recent times. And then I'll leave it to the experts to decide how can global value chains and for regional development in Latin America actually influence and affect future economic development prospects in these countries. And I'm going to start by presenting a vision that I think is widely shared, but is not that favorable about Latin America right now in relationship to the hopes that many Latin Americans themselves and many of us in other parts of the world had just 20 years ago. Because by 2000, just 20 years ago, we all had the impression that Latin America was going to be the continent of the future, the one that was going to take off, the one that was going to actually make a significant leap and achieve significant greater development for its citizens. And indeed, with variations across countries, across regions within countries, what we had was a relatively good decade of the 2010s. Sorry, the 2000s. Yet, the last decade has been relatively bad for the continent as a whole. Economic growth has stalled and has stalled significantly. There are exceptions. Countries like Panama and the Dominican Republic, which are the ones that are fundamentally more connected to the rest of the world, seem to have done far better than, for example, a country like Venezuela that has had the worst performance in the whole region, but also Haiti not doing very well. And many of the giants, Mexico represented here, Brazil, Argentina, not doing also particularly well in this period. It has been a decade in which we have seen significant polarization both across territories, but within, in terms of rising inequality, increasing in a region that was much more polarized than what we see, for example, in Europe or even in North America. Well, North America, US and Canada, of course, many parts of Latin America are North America. And also, it has been a country or a continent in which what we have seen has been a significant change in trade dependency, in which the main actor, that for long was the United States, has become far less prominent. And its vacuum, with the exceptions of Mexico and Colombia, although Mexico and Colombia has also grown, has been fundamentally filled by investment from China, with all the implications that positive and negative that it might have. On top of that, what we have had is that it never rains, but it pours. And the COVID pandemic hit many Latin American countries particularly hard. A continent that represents 8% of the population of the world had 28% of all recorded deaths. And well, you might want to think, maybe reporting, and there's some reporting, there's some underreporting, so you have to take all these figures with a pinch of salt. But countries like Peru, countries like Mexico had a particularly bad pandemic. And when you put all this together, it has led to a significant disenchantment by young generations of Latin Americans that is increasingly reflected in far more polarized politics, weaker states, and more fragile democracies that what seemed a significant shift towards what would be, let's say, strong democracies in the continent in the 1990s and throughout that, from the 1980s onwards. So there has been a regression also in terms of politics. Now the big question is, how do we get out of it? How do we go back or move out, spring out of a lost decade like the 2010s that to a certain extent replicates the 1980s and make most of Latin America dynamic again? And what is the role for global value chains to participate in this sort of process of regaining and redynamizing the whole of the continent? And in order to do that, we have two experts. I'm going to introduce you both in turn, not together. So I'll start with Ricardo, and then you can do your speech, and then I'll introduce Carlo. But we have our local, Professor Ricardo Crescenzi, who is my colleague at the Department of Geography and Environment at the LSE. I have his biography here, but I think I can probably say it by heart. He's a professor of economic geography with us, and he has been with us since, if I believe well, 2008, and a professor since 2014, 2015?
15 or 16.
2015, 16. So a very rapid progression to a chair, but also demonstrating his rising standing as one of the leading economic geographers and one of the leading scholars throughout, working on issues like multinationals, global value chains, and global production networks. He has held an ERC consolidator grant, so the biggest grant you can get in Europe, in which he developed his big project on the role of multinationals in the world, and has been very, very active on several research fronts. On top of that, what he is now is starting his new journey as an editor of the prestigious regional studies starting this week. So I wish him all the best. So whenever you want, Carlo, the floor is, oh, by the way, I forgot the most important part of so many papers, is that we're also here presenting from a global perspective his book, Harnessing, with Oliver Harman, Harnessing Global Value Chains for Regional Development. That has just appeared because it's one of the first books with the data 2023. So I think you're going to focus a lot on what you have in the book, and then you're going to zoom in slightly into Latin America. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Ricardo.
Thank you, Andres. Thank you very much for hosting me and for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you and Carlo today about harnessing global value chains in the context of Latin America. Should I use the microphone or is it okay?
It's okay.
It's okay. Fantastic. Can I use it? Let's see. Yeah, it works. Thank you. So what I will try to discuss is mostly a little bit of the basics of global value chains and link global value chains with the big questions of local and regional economic development. And this is like the book that Andres mentioned before. If you are interested, it's available online. So, like I said, the first key point is what can we learn from global value chains that can help with local and regional development in Latin America in order to leverage the opportunities offered by global value chains for economic development on the ground. And the book makes three key points. The first is that what we need to do is to understand how global value chains touch down on the ground, and how this touching down can generate economic development opportunities. So that's the first point that we discuss in this book, is how to look at global value chains that have been traditionally explored from an international economics perspective, how they can be reconceptualized and understood as drivers for something that happens on the ground at the local and regional level. The second point is we try to see, okay, how can we really understand the process of embedding? How can we really see how global value chains can generate economic development opportunities? And we focus in particular on how they can drive the process of upgrading. So trying to see how regions can change what they do within global value chains and across global value chains in terms of upgrading, moving towards progressively more sophisticated functions within global value chains. So this changes like a little bit the way in which we think about economic development and local economic development. That's something that is not necessarily to do with technological change with innovation, but with different ways to understand regional trajectories. And the third key point, the third important point that we make in the book is how can we use evidence to inform this process? How can we bring evidence that comes from across the world to inform policies designed to facilitate upgrading in and through global value chain. So these are the three key points that we make in the book that I will try to briefly discuss with you today. So what is a global value chain? Well, when thinking about it, of course, it's maybe not necessary today, but I think it's helpful because it helps us like thinking regionally about global value chain. So when we think about global value chain, we can really see like a global value chain as describing the full range of activities that firms, for example, and workers perform to bring a product from the very initial conception into end use and beyond. So it includes all the activities such as design, production, but then marketing, distribution, and then support to the final consumer. Okay, so that's what we mean by a value chain. And these value chains, this whole set of stages are progressively more and more being organized in multiple countries across the globe. So we move from the traditional understanding of also trade across countries in terms of traditional competitive advantage and comparative advantage in goods and services into something different. If we like think about global value chains, we more and more think about not only final goods, but we think about intermediate goods. We leverage here the traditional, if you want, example that comes from the World Bank that Daria has used in the World Development Report. If we see a bike, then we think about okay, how many goods do we see? And usually the idea, okay, yeah, well, that's a bike. That's one like final good, yes. But if we zoom into the bike, if we think about the production process of a bike in the value chain perspective that I mentioned before, we can see the different parts of this bike come from and are produced in very different countries, and different countries across the globe are really like the big exporters, the big producers of the different components of this bike. So the bike itself, the objective for a certain country, for a certain region in particular, is not necessary to jump into the production of bikes, to produce the whole bike, but it's really, at least at the beginning, to think about, okay, how can I specialize, how can I become an important, or I can start the production of one particular component of the bike, or how I can contribute to the development of this bike. And here we can see like how even something relatively simple as a bike is the result of the integration of so many different components produced in so many different countries across the globe. So for regions, when we think about the bike example, we can think about different trajectories. It's not really if we think the region has a particular competitive advantage in the bike, in the production of bikes, the objective for the region, the objective for its local and regional development policies is not to produce, or not necessarily to produce the entire bike. The issue becomes how, for example, the region itself can upgrade vertically or horizontally. For example, going from the production of a bicycle brake into the design of bicycle brakes. So you can remain, the region can remain within the production and can maintain a specialization in one particular component, but can think about its change in terms of doing something different from the simple production of the brakes of the bike into the design, for example. So moving into more like sophisticated, high value added activities by producing the same component, but doing something more sophisticated along the value chain. So the design of the brakes, that is what we call the vertical upgrading. A different option might be what we can call an horizontal upgrading, So going from the production of bicycle brakes into the production of something more sophisticated, still production, so we are still in the same stage, but of car brakes that are more sophisticated and add more value. So we have different possibilities within the same, without the need to produce the entire bike, that change the way in which we can think about the policy messages and the strategies that firms and regions can put in place when thinking about their development prospects. So why do global value chains matter for regional development? Well, they matter because they change the way in which we think about the objectives themselves of local and regional development strategies. Fundamentally, if we think about the traditional, the very well-known SMILE curve, and where we can see the different stages, the different steps that go, like I said before, from the conception, from the design of the product, research and development, design, into the production, and then the logistics and the marketing, the post-sales services, we can see how these different steps in the generation of the bike, for example, are linked with different degrees of value addition. So what adds a lot of value to the individual component or to the bike is the research and development behind the bike, the design of the bike, or, for example, the marketing and the services, but not necessarily the production itself. So this tells us that moving along the value chain can attract different degrees of value addition to the different regions. Like in the brake example that I mentioned before. And also in this chart, we can see how over time, the different stages have changed their capability to attract and control value. Production has become less and less a way to generate value, while more and more value has gone particularly starting in the 2000s, in the research and development, the design, and then in the sale and in the post-sale support. If you think about the other very typical example of the Apple iPhone, where is Apple concentrating its activities really in the design, in the research and development behind the phone, and then in the shops. It doesn't really own anything at all other stages of this chain. So for regions, the story becomes different. It's not really like how to go into new products, but it's really how you can do with existing specialization patterns, moving towards more sophisticated stages of the value chain. So we know that value chains matter, and they account for almost 50% of global trade today, although we know that it's something that with the pandemic, with the war, might be changing, and there are lots of open questions about the future of global value chains. However, current data seems really to suggest that value chains are still a very important component, and that they have shown remarkable resilience during the crisis and after the crisis and in this difficult time. So there is a lot that we really need as regional policymakers, as regional governments need to learn and understand about the global environment in order to be able to leverage global value chains for local economic development opportunities. So how can regions really leverage global value chains to their enhancement as part of their local and regional strategies? That's the big shift, if you want, in the policy paradigm. So when thinking about leveraging global value chains for regional development, you move away from what we can call an old paradigm of structural transformation, going from commodities to manufacturing and then services, into a more sophisticated, if you want, framework that is focused on the tasks. What is it that is being done at the local level? What is it that the region is doing? Moving from primary activities linked with production, so basic production, assembly, into progressively more sophisticated high value added tasks that the region can specialize into, going to the design, the commercialization, after sales services, and then moving ideally into the pre-production R&D, ecological development, specialized services. So the objective of local and regional development policies move away from shifting from one sector to another into less sophisticated, into more sophisticated sector. The focus really moves into the tasks that the regions can specialize into and move into, in terms of horizontal and vertical upgrading, as I mentioned before. So this is if you want, a different and complementary way of thinking about local and regional development and the potential objectives and targets of local and regional development. And this is like how the book really tries to think about global value chains. I don't want really to go into the details, but it's very important for local and regional policymakers that have traditionally focused on the local dimension. So that's about local and regional development. So we should focus on what happens internally within the region to start thinking about how global value chains are organized in order to be able to leverage opportunities from them. And in order to understand global value chains, local and regional policymakers more and more need to confront themselves with the key actors that exercise power in global value chains. And that's why the book tries to reflect on how global value chains are organized and what type of actors drive global value chains. Because these actors in different types of value chains, buyer-driven or supplier-driven chains, are the key counterparts for local and regional policymakers when it comes to negotiating different agreements, when it comes to understanding what type of conditions can attract different stages of the value chain. So it's very important for policymakers to understand who these new actors are, what their objectives are, what their drivers are, and what their strategic decisions can be. Okay, so this also changes, if you want, the degree of complexity of local and regional development policies, because local and regional policymakers not only deal with what happens locally, but they really need to understand the global and understand global strategies in order to be able to design their own local and regional development strategies. So this we can think about global value chains when trying to understand what is the role of multinational firms in global value chains. And when we want to zoom into the regions in the book, we try in particular to understand the role of foreign direct investment in what we call this global value chain policy loop. We go from global value chains to multinational enterprises as big orchestrators of global value chains that local policymakers can really engage with, through then zooming into the tools that multinationals use to control activities in multiple countries, foreign direct investments. And then we see, okay, this is the role of the region. This is where global value chains and regions can really get in touch and interact. That's the strategic level at which local and regional policymakers really need to think about when organizing their own strategies. So the book, in a sense, tries to leveraging examples from across the globe, including Latin America, tries to ask and address three fundamental issues: how we can build global value chains, so how regions can contribute to developing and generating global value chains, how regions can embed global value chains through foreign direct investment, so how they can attract particular points in the chain and embed these particular point of contact into the regional economy, develop the link, make sure that regions and local actors are really contributing to the chains, that the point where the value chain touches the ground are not cathedrals in the desert, are not things that are disconnected from the regional environment. And then how public policies can, in practice, based on evidence, leverage global value chains to the benefit of the local economy. So that's how we try to organize our discussion of global value chains to the benefit of local and regional policymakers. I will not go through each section of the book. Of course, I would just like to focus on the issue of horizontal and vertical engagement with global value chains, because we feel this might be particularly helpful when discussing about opportunities for Latin America and how this way of thinking about local and regional development can help regions in Latin America to engage successfully with global value chains. So when we think about the global value chain segment, and we think about how global value chains can be orchestrated by multinational enterprises, we say, okay, the way in which multinationals are going to control different activities in multiple countries along the chain is through foreign direct investments. And foreign direct investments really happen in specific regions. So for like foreign direct investments and activities controlled by multinationals to bring segments of a particular value chain into the region, we need to have the right horizontal conditions in place. We really need to have a set of conditions that facilitate and make it possible for foreign firms, for firms that want to pursue activities linked with a particular segment of the value chain in the local economy to be able to function and engage with the local economy. And this horizontal engagement has really to do with policies linked, for example, with hard infrastructure, with soft infrastructure and connectivity, incentives. And we will discuss how these incentives, in particular fiscal incentives, have been used. Andres was mentioning the example of Panama, for example, in different countries in Latin America. Human capital and education, skills and training that can be like targeted to particular tasks associated with different GVCs, labor market regulations and framework, standards and certifications, etc., etc. So these like fundamental conditions are not very different from what we have been like generally advising in terms of this is good for local actors, this is good for the traditional understanding of local and regional development and for economic development in general, as well as for like foreign actors and specific parts of the value chain to function on the ground. However, what we argue on the book, so we don't say this horizontal engagement, this sort of like horizontal background conditions are not important. They are indeed very important, and part of the failure of Latin American regions to benefit from global value chains and trade is linked with the lack of some of these fundamental conditions. However, we also argue that what we need in this particular moment of globalization, in order to engage for regions and cities to engage successfully for global value chains, is to go a step further. We need a proactive vertical engagement with global value chains. So while the horizontal engagement is fundamentally important, for when we think about global value chains, when we think about local and regional development in a GVC perspective, and is important in general. But we also need to go a step further and think about a vertical engagement with global value chains. That is what most of the regions are not necessarily doing or are not doing in the right manner. So what we think is that we need to proactively think about how institutions and organizations can be mobilized in order for regions to engage directly with the global actors that I mentioned before. And we discussed some examples in an evidence-based perspective, for example, mentioning the European experience with the investment promotion agencies. So targeted agencies that deliberately aim to attract specific type of foreign direct investment to match the local environment and generate the right conditions for these investments to be embedded into the local environment. To couple this with local linkage units. So attracting, for example, investments, attracting foreign activities is not enough. You really need to make sure that the local content is there, that these foreign activities embed more and more of the local value, that leverage the local assets in such a way as to build a resilient connection with global value chains, as well as to drive a process of domestic upgrading, so that also local activities, local firms and workers will benefit from the process of upgrading. So we think that the horizontal and vertical engagement with the global dimension should become like key points of reference in all local and regional development strategies. And when this fades, and both components in different cases have been weak, relatively weak in the Latin American example, when we fix these two components simultaneously, we might really have like important opportunities in terms of local and regional development strategies. Of course, like making this work really means that regional leaders and city leaders are also involved in international trade deals. So this means that international trade is not only a matter of the national government, it's also a matter of the regions, it's a matter of the local governments, because what happens in terms of trade, we have just discussed in terms of investment agreements, also has an impact on the ground. Different sectors have their own geographies. So this framework creates also the rationale for the involvement of local governments, of city-level governments into the design and the negotiation of free trade and investment agreements, for example. So this has to do with the like soft, if you want, more like political and is the institutional design area of public policies, as well as I mentioned before, with the design of specific agencies that might have the specific function of engaging with global value chains. And we have looked into this with the European example that has shown when you try and look at the impact of dedicated agencies targeting the attraction of foreign direct investments to less developed regions in Europe. When we compare regions that do not have an agency or regions before the agency starts being active and targeting a particular sector with a region or with a region that has an agency that proactively targets a particular sector, we do see that looking at we are looking at less developed regions in Europe. So regions that have a GDP per capita below 75% of the EU average, and we are looking at knowledge-intensive investments. And we do see that when an agency is active, even in the places where institutions are weaker, less developed regions of Europe, okay, think about Southern Italy, for example, but when these agencies are present and proactively target foreign direct investments, they are capable of establishing the links that I mentioned before. They are able to attract 71% more FDI vis-a-vis the non-treated, the regional sectors that do not receive the support of a dedicated agency. So this shows that engaging with global value chains through FDI is possible, and it is possible in places where institutions are relatively weak, where dedicated agencies with a clear, narrow mandate are established and put in motion and are given a clear mandate in terms of a selective sectoral target. I'd like to stop here, but really, like the same agencies can pursue a function of embedding the investment, like I mentioned before. So not only being successful in attracting the investment, but also in creating the conditions, and we have measured this in follow-up work, in looking at the impact of these agencies in preventing the divestment of activities, so the job losses, as well as in generating expansions of existing foreign firms. So this generates an important framework for the activities of these agencies. They can not only be there to attract investment, so tick the box, I attract this foreign firm that can start doing something new in the region, but also to facilitate the expansion of foreign activities, that is the embeddedness that I mentioned before, and to build the resilience, to reduce divestment, to reduce the divestment by foreign firm vis-a-vis what would have happened against a suitable counterfactual if, say, the agency is not there to support the activities of foreign firms. So we see this is a broad-ranging set of activities that dedicated agencies can pursue at the local level in order to proactively engage with global value chains and build not only new opportunities linked with the foreign activities, but also resilience to shocks. So Carlo will bring in a more, if you want, a critical and nuanced perspective, in particular with reference to Latin America. But I think it's very important to see how also thinking about global value chains for regional development can bring in new ideas when it comes to supporting the green transition, how what we call the green global value chains can be important tools to facilitate the green transition in the host regions, how greening value chains can have a knock-on effect on the host regions and can be used as a tool to facilitate the green transition in less developed regions, for example. But also important new ideas come with reference to the digital transition, how the use of artificial intelligence and new technologies changes the way in which global value chains can be leveraged, how work from home, for example, and the use of digital technologies on the workplace can generate new opportunities in regions by leveraging global value chains in services, for example. So there is a whole new agenda, but a whole set of new opportunities for local and regional policymakers to embrace global value chains, understand global value chains in the changing environment that is resulting from the pandemic and geopolitical tensions, and see what opportunities are there and how these opportunities can be leveraged at the local level. I stop here and I leave the floor to Carlo. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. And let me just first introduce Carlo Pietrovelli, who is it's an actual luxury to have him here, and we're very grateful that he agreed to come and talk to us. And Carlo is UNESCO Chair in Science, Technology and Innovation Policies for Sustainable Development in Latin America at the United Nations University UNIMERIT in Maastricht. And he's also a professor of economics at the Roma Tre University, where he has been dean until relatively recently. In his previous life, he was an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, and during a relatively long period in which we had significant interactions, he was the lead economist, 2009-2016, the lead economist at the Inter-American Development Bank, where he led the preparation of development loans in Latin America and the Caribbean on issues that are so relevant for today, like, for example, innovation and industrial policies, on cluster and value chain programs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and of course, the topic of local economic development. He has a broad range of research interests that go from development economics to innovation, trade, and industry in developing countries, and has published widely in international journals. And his last books were published by Harvard University Press, Edward Elgar, Palgrave, and Routledge. I can highlight among those the impact evaluation of cluster development programs, methods and practices, and also firm innovation and productivity in Latin America and the Caribbean. And today, he's going to then zoom in into these global value chains in Latin America. So without further ado, Carlo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andres. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, LSE. Very happy to be here and be able to share with you a few ideas about research on value chains and related policies and the relevance for Latin America. We heard already about the GVC approach. This approach has become increasingly popular over the last few years, a couple of decades by now.
Sorry to interrupt you, Carlo. If you go over there, you're not, people on YouTube cannot see you. So up to that limit, which is the table over there.
Right. Sorry, I usually walk when I talk, but I'll try to be in the area.
No, just up to here.
Up to here. Wonderful. All right. So the GVC approach, is this new? What is new in this approach? I think that there's a few keywords and a few elements that need to be emphasized relative to the past. The role of lead firms, the role of networks, the role of the governance, the way of organizing the chain and the relationships within the chain, as well as the flows of knowledge and the flows of technology that GVCs make possible. GVCs was initially interpreted as essentially a trade phenomenon, but I think is also remarkably an innovation and knowledge and organization related phenomenon, where inter-firm linkages can have remarkable bearing on the development of firms, on the upgrading and innovation by firms within value chains and elsewhere, and so on. And in particular, given that we're talking about value chains today and Latin America, is this moving? No.
You have to.
Well,
no, let me just.
Right hand side. We can do it.
Yeah. And now
do it now.
Do it now.
Right? Yeah. Nice moving. All right. So given that we're focusing our attention on Latin America, I gathered a few slides on the evidence of Latin America. And we see The first striking fact on Latin America is that Latin America is far behind other regions of the world in terms of GVC participation. Here we measure GVC participation as a percentage of total exports. I won't go into the methods, but essentially it's a way of looking at to what extent international trade is organized along value chains. And we see that the highest participation is enjoyed by Europe, the lowest by Latin America, and in between we have Africa and Asia. And of course, we're not surprised by Europe. I mean, it's largely integrated area. For Latin America, we are perhaps a bit more surprised that it's down here. Is this good or bad? It depends. We need to deepen the analysis and understand a bit what the role of GVCs can be in promoting development and enterprise development. And if we dive into Latin America, we see there's huge differences within the region. Again, the same indicator over a period of almost 30 years. And we see countries that have been relying on GVCs in terms of their international trade up to 50% or more, or others that didn't even reach 25%. And you may try to guess who are the countries up there, and they're mainly, the first one is Chile, second one is Peru, third one is Mexico, and down here we have Haiti, and we have Dominican Republic, and we have Paraguay. What's the difference? And behind this, there's also an issue that has to do with the mode of being part of a value chain. When we measure value chain, we look at backward and forward integration. That is, we look at to what extent countries contribute with inputs into other countries' production processes and exports, or to what extent countries receive inputs from others, assemble them, package them, add value to them, and then manage to export. Within Latin America, we see the two opposite models at a very large extent. That is, look at Peru, for example. That is essentially, we know it, a large provider of natural resources. That is, forward participation is much larger than backward participation, meaning that Peru is producing copper and silver and wood and natural resources that are then employed to export by other countries. But we also have a Mexico or Central America in this regard, Costa Rica and Panama and others, where a model known in Latin America as maquila operations, in bond assembly somehow, relies on a totally different method. That is, importing intermediate inputs and services, adding value, processing them, assembling them, and then exporting them. It's a totally different way of organizing production. And the analysis is trying to go deeper in understanding to what extent backward and forward have an implication for development, growth, enterprise development, and so on. We're not clear yet. I don't think we've reached a conclusion what is preferable, and when, and to what extent, and what conditions, and condition on what elements. One dimension is preferable to the other one. To be true, the reality is that this heavily depends on the nature of comparative advantage in each country and the resources they have and the kind of advantages they can offer. Mexico mainly offers low-cost labor, whereas Peru offers natural resources. And therefore, the prevailing GVCs are different, as it was explained. And in addition to that, in these years of COVID and pandemic and war and rising protectionism, and a lot of countries have been promoting policies to induce their firms to invest back in their own countries, notably the US as well as Europe. I mean, the fear of deindustrialization in Europe has been leading many countries to invoke their own firms to invest back and bring back part of their activities instead of investing in China or Bulgaria or somewhere else from Europe, bringing them back. And to what extent is this really happening? There's a lot of discussion, a lot of newspapers talking about this, and policymakers, and bringing the usual jargon, talking about bringing jobs back home, which we heard from many policymakers. We tried to, in a new working paper that came out yesterday, as a matter of fact, we tried to develop some thinking and evidence on whether any of these elements, that is shoring back activities or shoring in nearby countries, or shoring to friendly countries that promise to be more friendly to us, and therefore provide us with stronger guarantees to ensure continuity of activities, continuity of employment, and so on. We looked into the evidence for Latin America, and we also wondered to what extent Latin America would be ready for this kind of processes. In a nutshell, Latin America does not seem to be ready, and very little of this is happening in Latin America. For as far as the evidence is concerned, we tried to use different macro and trade and sectoral data and trading value added and so on. I'm showing you just one diagram here, which is the evolution in the share of US imports as a percentage of domestic demand. That is, domestic demand in the US is 100. We wondered to what extent this is fulfilled by imports, and imports from which country, which region of the world. And what we discover here is something that we probably would expect. That is, in gross imports as well as in intermediate imports, China is leading the plot here. In imports and final goods imports rather than intermediate goods imports, we see that Mexico, the dotted line, the black dotted line up there, is doing fairly well. Much less in terms of intermediate imports, reflecting that kind of specialization in GVCs of an assembly type, where they import intermediate goods, assemble them, and export. But we see the rest of Latin America is this dotted line down here, dotted line down there. It's really below the plot, it's really behind in terms of showing evidence of rising nearshoring or backshoring. This is very difficult to because this has a remarkable firm level dimension, but we did our best to try to gather some evidence. And eventually, I'm saying that this is not happening yet. I'm wondering to what extent this might happen, and whether Latin America could be eventually ready to attract this kind of investments and to benefit from them. Because one thing is attracting, and the other one is, as we learned from Ricardo, that building and embedding and growing capabilities together with investment, or thanks to investment. And we try to, a bit of imagination, trying to put together a number of data and evidence, trying to measure to what extent a country would be ready to attract and use this for investment by thinking about physical infrastructure, digital infrastructure, the technical human capital of different kinds, investment in innovation of different kinds, resilience, proximity to markets, and so on. And the evidence we gathered, again, is not very promising for Latin America. So it doesn't seem to be, even if this process of reshoring and backshoring by multinational corporations that used to invest elsewhere, they could decide to invest and source some of their activities from Latin America. We don't think that so far Latin America would be ready to encourage this process. In light of all this, and somehow reflecting what Ricardo was mentioning before, and his recent book, my main argument today is that GVCs are so widespread and are changing the way of organizing business to such an extent, in spite of the recent decreases and in spite of the doubts about the rising protectionism and the fears of the war and the pandemic and so on, but it's still 30, 40, 50, 60% of total trade. So it still matters a lot. And this needs to force us to rethink deeply about economic policies. A number of policies need to be reconsidered in light of this different way of organizing production. And to this aim, together with two colleagues, with Roberta Rabelotti and Heidi Van Asche, we developed, we promoted a special issue in the Journal of International Business Policy, where we called for papers that somehow refer to the idea of policies with the GVC component, or with the GVC focus. And we managed to receive a number of different papers. They were published last year, and thanks to all these papers, we managed to induce somehow a typology of different forms of value chain oriented policies. And these are the four categories. This is not something we defined ourselves, but it was induced and derived from the data, from the evidence, the qualitative evidence of these many different papers that were presented to be published in the special issue. And we found out that some policies have as the main objective the attraction and the increasing and strengthening the participation of local firms into value chains. Secondly, there's a rising number of policies that aim at capturing value. Using Ricardo's language, we might translate it into embedding or reshaping and so on. So really, the value that is offered by integration into value chains is not taken for granted. It needs to be captured, needs to be actively extracted from the chain. But at the same time, many countries realize that GVCs also have a downside, also bring about exploitative practices many times, environmentally unsustainable practices many times, and therefore a number of policies were created to take into account this inclusiveness, this inclusiveness dimension, and try to induce global firms to behave differently and organize activities differently and so on. And finally, the most recent category is the category working on resilience and strengthening the resilience of the country vis-a-vis value chains. We studied a bit the economic rationale behind these different policies, and we discovered that participation and integration policies tend to replicate the traditional reasoning of horizontal policies, of the kind of doing business style, the kind of facilitating and making easier international trade by improving regulation, by strengthening infrastructure, by reducing obstructions to markets and protection and so on. Whereas value capture policies typically find their justification in vertical activities, and therefore, things like the typical market failures related to power asymmetries, related to information asymmetries, related to coordination failures, and so on, that induce countries to think that policies would be required in order to help firms capture value from the value chains. And then inclusiveness policies, and increasingly in inclusiveness policies, we discovered that there is an effort to engage lead firms, to engage large corporations into this process and induce them in contributing to improving social and environmental welfare. And finally, with resilience policies, there's the overarching worry by most governments is the worry of making sure that they manage to provide the public goods and the necessary services and goods whenever an emergency arises. And therefore, this has been inducing countries, for example, to move part of production of drugs back home, or modify the shape of the value chain depending on this objective, and making sure that it can fulfill this kind of objectives. If we go to the specific tools and instruments of public policy, we managed to get this long list of examples in each of these categories: removing obstacles to trade, improving the business environment, strengthening skills, linkages, providing business services, different kinds of reforms, promoting private and social environmental sustainability standards, and so on. So you might say, we already know this, we've seen this for many years. What is different? If we did not frame this with the GVC language and this kind of GVC approach, we could have end up saying that this is something that we've seen for years and years. And I don't think so. I think there's something new in this regard. And this is what we called in the introductory paper of the special issue, the trifecta, la triplice, the three elements that we think make these kind of policies different. The first one is the focus on tasks. It's not anymore a focus on finished products or complete productions and sectors and industries or subsectors. It's really going deeper, going to the finer stages of the value chain, the finer functions and roles and tasks that are developed along the value chain. And this requires a much more granular view from the policymaker, shaping and designing and implementing policies in a different way. Secondly, a new focus on linkages. What matters is not only the individual components of a system, but also the linkages that occur within the different agents. And thirdly, the firm level dimension, enterprises, understanding the logic of enterprise behavior, not only lead firms and multinational corporations, but also suppliers at different tiers that reason differently. They have different strategies and logic, and shaping a policy to take account of this is increasingly necessary and needs to reframe part of the tools that we've already seen in other circumstances, but need to be retaught and reconsidered. Let me finish with three examples of what I see as good examples, interesting examples. Some of them have not been evaluated. We don't fully know the results. This is, in some cases, this is just an initial process that was started very recently, but I think can help me give an idea of what I consider GVC-oriented policy. And one comes from Costa Rica. This is a well-known case of an investment attraction agency that managed to attract specific investors to fill a vacuum in the value chain. There was a missing link in the chain. This refers to the sterilization of medical devices in Costa Rica. The country was already very active and successful in medical devices at the beginning of the 2000, but at that time only very low complexity and low value added medical devices were produced and exported. The government, and interestingly to say, the CINDE, which is the local investment attraction agency, which is a private entity that was put together by the Federation of Industry with the benign support of the government, the Ministry of Trade, but it was a private initiative somehow. And they realized that there was a specific function in the process of producing more sophisticated medical devices, heart valves, for example, that add much more value than plastic tubes and so on. And the market was not providing the kind of services that were necessary to perform these activities. So they went abroad, they found companies in the US, managed to attract one of them that made an investment in the country. Others followed suit, and this allowed existing firms in the country to link up, to obtain these services locally, and then add value and extend their activities into other activities closer to the market. So upgrading in a way and entering into different stages of the value chain. So this is something that I would call a GVC-oriented policy, an investment attraction policy that was motivated and shaped by the specific needs of a value chain. The second example comes from Malaysia, and we all know that in production of advanced manufacturers, electronics, software as well, they require specialized institutions and specialized services. And the government realized this, and they've been investing heavily in creating business development services centers and technology centers and labs that in some cases were financed and produced by the private initiative, but in many other cases by joint initiatives within business and government. And examples come from this National Applied Research and Development Center, as well as the Penang Skills Development Center in the Penang Special Economic Zone, which was created as a public-private initiative in 1989 with HP, Intel, Motorola, and the government. And this again reveals an awareness that a well-functioning value chain and the possibility of capturing value out of the value chain requires the availability of a number of technical services and labs that, due to their public good or club good nature, would not be developed by individual firms, and they require some public intervention to be provided. The third example is still in the making, is Vietnam's supporting industries policy framework. In Vietnam, they call supporting industries the industries that are part of a value chain, the local suppliers and the local providers that operate within a value chain. And they realize that in spite of being one of the countries that most engaged in global value chains, they're still capturing little value. They're still staying in very low levels of value added, low levels of wages, innovation is still being very limited, and so on. So they realized, and that a major policy objective should be to raise the domestic value added. And they launched in 2020, they launched a 10-year program that would aim at strengthening supporting industries using different techniques, strengthening spillovers from foreign companies, helping local firms develop absorptive capacity and technological capabilities, improving the institutional framework to make this engagement possible within local firms and multinational corporations in different tiers of the value chains, and so on. So another interesting example of how policy should take a very encompassing, integration-like approach to consider different dimensions of a value chain and exploit the potential offered by business as well as government, and shape new policies that take into account this new nature of value chains. This is all, of course, I'm here to discuss with you elements of this. To what extent this is desirable for Latin America, we're still working on that. But I think there's still a lot to do in order to increase awareness of how these policies may look old, but they need to be designed in a different way and implemented in a further different way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlo, and thank you very much, Ricardo. I think now we have until 8 o'clock, so we have some time for questions. And before I start, I think we have raised quite a lot of important issues, but they come here to the middle, and then we can share, and we can also see the dialogue. So you can
get the projector live.
So, fine. Are there any questions coming from the audience? Yes, go ahead and please state your name.
Thanks. My name is Amir. I have a question, I guess, that applies to all, which is, the global context of reshoring, friendshoring, which I was surprised to see it's already kind of studied and analyzed. So in the context of the trade wars and geopolitical competition between US and China, especially around low carbon technologies, to what extent do you think that regions like Latin America could benefit from it to attract the much desired and controversial supply chains around low carbon technologies, right? Whether it's solar cells, electric batteries, they might be missing capabilities, but this is kind of where both of your presentations really overlap, right? So do you see any discussion around it? Is it only political? I mean, how much do the politics really shape that process? No, open-ended, but very timely.
This is a big question, huh? Behind my argument here, there's the idea, the intuition that GVCs are important, can be important, but they're only one piece of the story. And I would go back to the old ideas of the need to invest in local technologies, local capabilities, local institutions. So GVCs by themselves alone, they would not solve problems unless they are accompanied by local effort to combine or to help local firms exploit the potential and then capture value. From what we are seeing, Latin America does not seem to be very strongly committed or well equipped with this kind of favorable circumstances. But I think that's something that one has to learn how to deal with, because this is there, and this way of organizing international trade is there. I don't think it's going back to a large extent.
I think kind of the experience of Latin America is also very scattered geographically, in the sense that you have like specific hotspots that have been able to like link up to global value chains and generate like local benefits. I think the big question is how and to what extent these benefits can materialize in an inclusive manner, can really like spread outside the specific special economic zones or areas that have benefited from particularly favorable regimes. Mm-hmm. So how and to what extent, without this particular support or keeping this support focused on specific sectors and specific areas, then benefit can go outside the target areas and generate sustainable development outside the specific hotspots, the specific hubs. In terms of like linking with opportunities, linked with the green transition, of course, it's clear that there are important opportunities also in technological terms, mm-hmm. and that might allow specific industries to like move up the value chain and go from extraction, from simple processing of minerals into like trying to incorporate locally more and more of the value, and so take this opportunity to engage in a new manner with global value chain. So I think it is important to like give, in particular, local policymakers the sign that there are opportunities out there, that there are global, and that link with the green transition, link with this new evolving organization of green supply chains that can generate benefits at the local level. It's still like unclear how and to what extent like Latin America as a region overall is equipped with the right conditions, but there might be like local exceptions. That can be places where this process can be started and triggered. And there might be places where then change is diffused more widely. In the book, we try and argue that engaging with foreign firms, engaging with global value chains can also be like a way for institutionally weaker regions and countries to get started somewhere, can be an important like stepping stone to get started also with the process of institutional change.
Yeah, no, I agree. We tend to think of Latin America as a region, but indeed, it takes much longer to travel from Sao Paulo to Quito than from Sao Paulo to Miami or even Europe. So the region is not really integrated physically, infrastructure-wise. I mean, they have tremendous advantage of sharing the same language, partly the same culture, but you know, this large distances across countries. So it's somehow a bit too fast to think of, you know, this discourse about developing regional value chains and having manufactured producers from Sao Paulo sourcing their inputs from Ecuador or Peru or somewhere else. But it's still dreaming a bit too high, I think. But of course, I agree. I mean, the big challenge, I mean, beyond value chains, that the major challenge that Latin America is facing is the tremendous inequality. I mean, there's still a few countries in the region are still the most unequal countries in the world. That's problem number one, GVC or non-GVCs.
If I may intervene here, I think you raised, I mean, apart from this rather pessimistic view of the situation in Latin America, the question is, how can you get, because you raised the question now, Ricardo, at the end, this learning processes that would facilitate that any sort of participation into global value chains would have some sort of impact on the wider network of local firms, which evidence coming not just from Latin America, but from many less developed countries tends to highlight that the benefits, if anything, are very much constrained to the areas where that happens, whether it is very specific special economic zones or certain areas and not beyond that. And Ricardo, in your presentation, you raised two sort of dimensions: the horizontal dimension, which is doing what has been done or has been tried to be done in the past, improving human capital, improving soft infrastructure, hard infrastructure, given more incentive, like, for example, Panama, that was mentioned before. I'll go into these countries later and the differentiations. But you also put the emphasis, and as you put in your book with Oliver, on the vertical, the presence of agencies. But one of the issues here, and I think that the examples coming from Carlo highlighted, is can these agencies really work? First, in the absence of the basic conditions. So if you haven't got the right human capital, you haven't got the right infrastructure, you haven't got the right sort of firms, local firms that can become the producers, well, the suppliers, and sometimes the customers. So that we can build backward and forward linkages. Can they work? And second, if you have weak institutional conditions, for example, widespread corruption, how can these, let's say, vertical agencies, the investment agencies that would link, bypass that corruption and become honest brokers that would attract the best sort of investment that would match, let's say, the local economic fabric?
Yes, Andres, this is an excellent question. I think the proposition that comes from the book and that we try to support with evidence coming from different cases is that the engagement with the global level can be like an helpful, if not a decisive, but an helpful shortcut around local institutional failure. So the idea is that where do we start? We cannot try, of course, I mean, this is something desirable to fix the institutional environment overall, to improve institutional quality in the whole region or in the whole country. But we know this is very difficult. And the fundamental question that comes from people on the ground is how do we start? How can we start to bring about this process of institutional change when this has failed, like in the case that we discuss in the book of Southern Italy, for example, for a number of decades. So the idea is that engaging with the global level can be a possible stepping stone, a possible way to bypass the local sort of lock-in, institutional lock-in conditions. And well-designed agencies that are relatively lean can be also, that do not necessarily need to be created ad hoc, can be particular body within existing regional governments, endowed with a very clear mandate, with very clear performance indicators, can be a means to bypass this type of local institutional lock-in situations by engaging with with global actors that might be requesting, for example, certain type of skills to be developed, that might request certain type of infrastructure to be developed, a certain typology of connectivity. So using global actors to understand the nature of local institutional failure, to understand the nature of local market failures, and get started in the process of fixing this failure, and also engaging in a critical manner with these global actors, also bringing the resources, so saying, okay, this is what we can offer, but this is also what these local actors need to bring, so can bring opportunities to also to give resources, to give the right incentives for people and local actors to align their interests. So if you want this investment to happen against multiple alternative locations, then you need to put your household in order. So this can also create the right type of incentive to align the strategies of the different local actors towards a common goal. And this might be together, of course, with other coordinated measures, a way to try and get started in the process of institutional improvement at the local level.
And in addition to that, I think that one should really look at the experiences that have been successful and try to build on them. Because some of the examples I was making highlight the evidence of different kinds of institutions, public, private, or only public, national, local, or cluster level, and nobody knows exactly what is working and in what circumstances and so on. But we know something has been working, and I think the great challenge is to learn from that and try to replicate it, and try to build on that, and try to really start with institutions that work a little and help them grow stronger and use different practices and so on. But start with something that is working and has been working in Latin America. There are numbers of excellent examples of local or national or sectoral ways of designing and implementing public policies that can be strengthened, and starting from there is a good point.
You mentioned how heterogeneous the region is. And of course, there has been significant diversity in terms of economic performance, especially in the 2010s. And I highlighted in my introduction that the two most dynamic countries are two that are actively engaged with the outside world. Fundamentally, the Dominican Republic through the proliferation of special economic zones, and then second, Panama, as a result of a huge level of fiscal incentives and the lowest level of taxation in the region. To what extent do you think that first these two cases are durable, and are they examples for the rest of the region? Or when you go more into more complex sort of economies, like the big economies in Latin America, whether it is Brazil, whether it is Mexico, Argentina, Chile, or Colombia, can they learn from these small countries, or do they have to follow a completely different path?
Well, I think, there's definitely something to learn, but I would say that Panama's and the Dominican Republic's strategies, especially apt for countries of that kind, that is small, closer to advanced markets, mainly the US, with especially Panama, with a strong human capital, with a favorable attitude of foreign investors that used to invest there, have been investing there, especially in the financial sector for many years. So building on that, these countries managed to be more successful than others. Larger countries have a lot of other potentials as well. I mean, one example, the new developments in agriculture and the use of digital technologies, what is known as smart agriculture or Industry 4.0 for agriculture, that is an activity that is proliferating in Argentina and southern Brazil, that are among the leaders in the world of this kind of practices, which have a lot GVC logic with the infusion of digital technologies, and I think they have a tremendous potential. So looking at natural resources not anymore as a curse, but as a possibility to build on them thanks to different technologies, different organization, and add a substantial value to these sectors is something new that was not experienced until the last few years. And on top of that, not only digital, but also think of all the efforts and the developments in biotechnologies, in advanced research, somehow functionally upgrading backwards instead of learning how to produce bread from wheat, going back and developing different kinds of wheat, and wheat that is more resistant to weather and different conditions and so on, with a lot of research and and this adds a lot of value. Argentina is a good example of this kind of thing.
And the final question coming from me, which is mainly related to foreign direct investment. What we have seen over the last 20 years is that a region where foreign direct investment mainly came from the US became first diversified with the eruption of other actors, in this case, for example, Spain, but some other European countries like France, to a lesser extent Germany and the UK, that turn out not to be as important, as durable, as especially in the case of Spain since the economic crisis, but then also the huge introduction of China as now the main investor in Latin America. What are the implications for most of Latin America as a result of that? Because the type of investment is very different from the one that was coming from the US. And how can they maximize the benefits of having a new investor like China and minimize the potential risks that we are seeing, for example, now coming to light in the case of places like Sri Lanka, and probably the high dependency that Africa has on Chinese investment?
You want to start?
I think in this area, it becomes particularly important what we mentioned before of understanding the nature of your counterparts and what are like the strategic objectives of the investors that come and operate in the regional economy. And the example of China and the activities of Chinese investors, for example, in Africa, it's a very important experimental field from which Latin American authorities and governments can learn from and understand how and to what extent these investments have been able to produce local benefits, under what conditions. We looked, for example, at Chinese foreign direct investments in Ethiopia, and looked at what type of, under what conditions and what type of districts in Ethiopia these investments have been able to generate benefits, and through what channels and through what type of interactions with domestic firms. So this is to say that there might be opportunities that is not necessarily something bad for economic development. It really very much depends on the type of engagement that you develop. When we looked at the experience of Africa, for example, when engaging with Chinese investments, we really identified a process of creating destruction that in the short run, we did see like local firms suffering from the competition of Chinese activities being established in Ethiopia. But then in the medium run, we saw like a process of like local adjustment and the development of the domestic response and the capability of some selected domestic firms to become suppliers of these foreign investors. So the issue is really like the challenge in terms of engaging with global value chains. It's really like understanding how new investors or all the new investors like behave and what are the type of benefits that might be able to generate and under what conditions in order to enhance these conditions and counteract the potential like side effects. Now that make sure we mentioned, go back to the previous question, the issue of Panama, it's also very important to make sure that this type of engagement with local actors does not become the opportunity for like real estate speculation. So in terms of like creating like benefits that are not incorporated by particular agents on the ground, but that are spread in an equitable manner. So in this like reorganization of typologies of investors and in global value chains, this becomes particularly important to endow local policymakers and national policymakers with the tools to understand the strategic potential trade-offs and to give them the right steer towards the development of the right conditions to benefit from the opportunities and minimize the potential side effects.
Yeah, and I would also emphasize the risks of Chinese investments. I mean, the examples you were giving before of a foreign investment as a strong inducement to improve institutions and practices and codes of conduct and so on, which is being contradicted by Chinese investment in Africa, where they've been intentionally going and jumping over established institutions and negotiating with ministers and coming with free money. And so all the effort that governments do in order to introduce principles of good management and wise investments and so on has been overcome by these investments. So I agree, helping governments learn how to deal with investors to maximize the benefits and to look after the risks, because I see a lot of risks this way, this kind of investments from China.
Okay, thank you very much. Unless we're coming to the end of our meeting, so yes, one quick question, Ivan, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentations. Were really enjoyable to hear you. Considering that the awareness of many national governments and subnational governments in Latin America is low, but I would say it's not only the awareness, but also the willingness to develop these kind of things. What would you think that could be the role of international development agencies? Because a lot of money is spent every year by the OECD, the World Bank, other kind of agencies. What would be the role of them to really try to increase this awareness and willingness to try to change things and incorporate this in Latin America? And also if they could influence a little bit other local agents in Latin America, like maybe universities, local universities, or NGOs, that then could start the process towards not only promotion agencies, but agencies of change in Latin America. What do you think?
In my mind, international organizations should play the role of honest brokers, facilitating exchanges, working as partners. You know, many of these words have been abused in real practice, but you know, in the true sense, being a partner that is sitting next to the minister and bringing experiences from other places and helping governments to think and design and implement, evaluate and understand and learn from evaluations, all this wealth of knowledge that is that many development institutions have, And this capacity of bringing back and forth examples and lessons learned from different parts, and the need to relearn, because I don't think there's best practices that can be employed everywhere. I mean, there are good practices from which one can learn and then have to reinvent the wheel for its own country. That's the attitude I think this should be. But I think that in my mind, this should be the role of multinational organizations.
Bringing evidence, not bringing examples of what works in practice. We discussed the example of the territorial reviews for when looking at the local level, the OECD and the territorial reviews. I was like considering the case I was involved in, the case of Hidalgo, for example, in Mexico, and a state wanted to develop a model of local and regional economic development at the state level, trying to leverage FDI and global engagement. Not having the OECD bringing like evidence-based insights on how this could be achieved in practice is certainly something that, in particular, given the complexities of this type of policies that we have discussed, has the potential to be a discriminant factor between success and failure. So this is, of course, this needs to come like from the desire and the alignment of objectives and strategies at the local level. It's not something that can be imposed from the top down as the engagement with global value chains, but multinational organizations, multilateral organization development institutions can facilitate this process by bringing in knowledge, by bringing in examples based on solid evidence on what type of tools can be put on the table that work in practice, and at the same time contribute to funding, to financing some of these tools where local resources are not sufficient. So there is this generation of demand for funds, but also supplying where necessary the funds to allow virtuous policies to emerge, to facilitate the selection of the best policies through through funding opportunities.
I would add that the financing role of multilateral organizations is especially important in evaluations, because evaluation, that nobody wants to finance evaluation, just where is a government that wants to be evaluated while they're still in power, you know? And eventually the results will influence the behavior of the next government, not my government. And therefore, why should I pay for that? So I think financing it internationally and providing good examples and practices and measuring evidence and so on would be very usefully financed by multilateral organizations.
Okay, so thank you very much for all your participation. Both of you for being here. I would like to thank Daria Taglioni, who wanted to come but couldn't make it. All of you sitting in this room, thanks for coming. And to all of you following us in our YouTube channel, we're grateful for your custom, for being our followers of the Cañada-Blanch Centre. And remember that at the Cañada-Blanch Centre, from now on, events are going to happen thick and fast. So immediately following this session on global value chains in regional development in Latin America, on Thursday, the 19th of January, we'll have Javier Revilla-Diaz from the University of Cologne, who's going to be talking about development and the growth corridor approach in Africa. And that will be followed not that far off. So on the 9th, Thursday, the 9th of February, by an intervention by the Governor of the Bank of Spain, Pablo Hernández de Cos. So keep on following us on Twitter, keep on following us on LinkedIn, keep on being informed about our developments, and we'll continue just raising all these issues that I think are very important to understand the current world we're in. So thank you very much, and see you at the next meeting. Thanks to Victor for organizing everything. Thanks.